Hi everyone, welcome to The Superficial Spirit, where we explore how pop culture affects our spiritual experiences. My name is Peter Breeze. Join me while we ask a very important question. What the hell did pop culture do to me? Welcome to The Superficial Spirit. Thanks so much for being here again with me today. I'm so excited for this show because I have, as you know, been very curious about unconventional ways that people discover their spirituality. And when I first started the show, pop culture was the main focus because I wanted to know how the superficial parts of our world can actually be conduits for spirituality. And through exploring the different conversations and doing my own research, I found a few topics that I'm equally as passionate about that I think are really interesting. And one of those topics is mental health and spirituality, and specifically what happens when somebody has some mental health issues that they are experiencing and describing as spiritual that may actually be symptoms of a mental health condition. I don't know. I find this so fascinating because spirituality is interesting in that it's self-anointed. Like you can describe something as spiritual that other people might raise their eyebrows and be like, I don't know if that's spiritual. And I've also talked about that on the show, about whether or not anything can be considered spiritual. And I'm still deciding what I think about that. I mean, I do think, if you go into the realm of your spiritual practice hurting or affecting other people in negative ways, then I don't think I would consider that spiritual. But that still leaves a huge arena open for what can be considered spiritual, things that people do by themselves or with their friends and family that doesn't hurt them, that maybe would sound strange to someone else, but actually enriches their spiritual life. This is what I'm so passionate about. That is the superficial spirit, is when we move outside of the parameters that we have classified as spiritual and non-spiritual, what does it mean? And what does it look like? And if everybody truly can have a unique spiritual experience and create a unique spiritual life that's specific to them and their needs, what does that say about spirituality in general? What does that say about religion? If you can create your own system, your own parameters to which you allow yourself to experience divine energy, what does that? Do we need organized religion? I don't know. What does that say about spiritual leaders if people can cultivate it themselves? It's interesting. I'm super curious about it. And today I found somebody who has an interesting story because he works in the mental health field as a professional at CAMH here in Toronto. And there was a story about him on CBC that I found, basically exploring how do you tell the difference between a spiritual experience and a mental health crisis. So I am super excited to have him on the show today. His name is Shawn Lucas. He's right here in Toronto. So without further ado, let's bring him on the show. Hello, Shawn. I'm so glad that we get to chat because I have a podcast about spirituality, and my personal story is about how pop cultures and celebrities and those types of superficial things actually ended up being a conduit for my spirituality and the way that I uncovered that side of myself. And so when quarantine first happened, I was like, God, I need to find something to do. And so I started the podcast, and a lot of the early conversations were with people like me who really were obsessed with pop culture or nightlife or performing, and that opened them up. And then I was like, wait a second, there has to be other conversations about spirituality that are equally as interesting and unconventional. And I recently was going through some mental health situations with my doctor, and the conversation about cyclothymia came up. And for those people who don't know, it's on the bipolar spectrum, but mild. And I did a lot of research about that. And I was reading about people who had these manic episodes, but were describing them as spiritual. And I had this moment where I was like, oh my God, my whole life, I've had like I'm really creative, high energy, and I interpreted that always as like channeling energy or divine presence in my life, like super creative, super ambitious, lots of energy, and that was always a positive thing. And I, for a
Right.
moment, was considering, wow, what would that be if that was a diagnosis or a symptom of a mental illness or a condition, and how destabilizing or disorienting it would be to have to reframe the way you experience those episodes. I don't think I have cyclotherapy. After doing a lot of research and talking to my doctor, we moved on from that. But yeah, that's when I started researching about mental health and spirituality and how these symptoms can probably be very confusing for people.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating, and what you describe is we see quite a lot is basically people who have they have a mental illness, but within the mental illness or the experience of the mental illness, they have these wonderful transcendent experience. So I use the word transcendent because I think it describes something very specific. And when you want to do research, they want you to be able to research something that you can measure. So transcendence means like an event or an experience that connects you with something greater than yourself. Um, for some people that might be God or a higher power. For other people, it might be nature or something. But it's something that gets you outside of who you are as a person, and and then also simultaneously gives you some sort of insight into your own life and your own situation, which then often propels people towards a kind of wellness. Now, because this often happens in conjunction with a mental illness, in hospitals, we tend to throw it all into the mental illness bucket. And what I've been advocating for is, yes, absolutely, let us treat the mental illness for sure. But at the same time, if people are having these wonderful transcendent experiences, can we take that out of the mental illness experience to help people to perhaps see that there's something positive that's also happening within them, that is maybe leading them to something um, uh, greater than the mental illness state that they're experiencing.
It's so great that somebody like you in the mental health field is approaching this topic and is trying to implement it more into the way we approach mental health and healing. And I'm thinking how many people in history have probably needed that kind of validation from somebody to say, yes, you know what, it does look like there may be some mental situations that we need to deal with, but also this could also be very, very beneficial. You know, these transcendental experiences seem like they're leading you in a healthy direction, and let's explore that more because I don't know. I mean, it wasn't a conversation that my doctor had with me, and a lot of people that I know in the recovery community, spirituality is the missing link. It is what bridges the gap between how do I be a functioning adult with the issues that I have in my life. And I'm wondering, like, how did you approach this topic? How did it come into your life, and why did you decide it was so important?
Well, I've had my own mental health experiences. I've lived with depression for most of my life. I continue to take medication for depression. I've lived with addictions as well. And I had a very kind of dark period in my life where I was very kind of close to being suicidal. And I had been seeing this spiritual counselor at the university I was attending at the time, and I had never prayed before, and she had suggested to try meditation and to try prayer, and I did, and I had this kind of profound experience where I went back home and I slept for like 24 hours. And
Wow.
in this 24-hour period, I woke up, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to pick up or to use. And I also had this, it was like a pinhole in the darkness, a feeling of self-respect, which I hadn't had before. And that was about 24 years ago, or 25 years ago. And that caused me to think, I've had several other experiences since then, but it caused me to remember some other experiences in my life where I felt connected to something greater than myself. And whenever I feel connected to that thing that's greater than myself, whatever language you want to use, I use the divine. I like the word divine because it's kind of a catch-all. The word God literally means the object of our worship. So
Mm.
I could be worshiping this picture on the wall. That could be my God. So God isn't really clear enough for me. So I use the word divinity because it describes things that I can't see or touch or whatever. But I feel like I can experience them within myself.
Mm.
And this is where, for me, I try to focus on emotional experiences because I believe that our emotions are probably more in tune to these experiences than our intellect. Um,
Yes.
and so I try to help people to touch base with that experience through whatever emotion they were experiencing at that moment. And so then um, so just going back to my own experience, those experiences just kind of led me into my own recovery, which led me to doing a master of divinity, and then I just started researching this more and more, and I'm kind of continuing to research it now. I'm hoping to do a doctorate and do some research on this as we go forward.
When you were first having that first transcendental experience, where you felt a sense that there was something greater than you out there, were you already working in the mental health field, or did you come to that after?
I came to that after I was in university at the time in my undergraduate degree. Yeah.
Wow. So were you planning on going into mental health when you had that experience, or how did those two relate to each other?
It's so strange because my hope was to go to law school actually.
Wow.
So
Oh my
uh,
God.
so I kind of changed course, went into applied for a Master of Divinity at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. I got accepted into that program, and I won't say the rest is history because it took me a while to the one thing I guess I want to explain to people is that even though people have had these transcendental experiences, there's still work to be done. And for me, there was lots of work, internal work to be done. And I had to kind of do that while I was doing an MDiv. And yeah, it's a long, crazy road.
Yeah, from my experience too, it was similar where you get the initial rush or the spark. Something happens where you're like, "Oh my gosh, there definitely is something else." And this is something I've heard in my conversations is if you haven't had one of these experiences and you're hearing other people talk about it, it can be kind of like, I don't know, that seems a little out there. But then when it happens to you, like you said, it's so emotionally based. And when you meditate and you feel what can happen, you don't need anything further than that. Like, without a doubt that it's true and it's helpful, but that is just the starting point. And then it's up to you to cultivate that in various ways. And there's so many ways you can cultivate a spiritual experience, and ongoing in your life. What do you do now at CAMH, and how do you bring this to your work?
So I work as a manager of spiritual care services at CAMH, and I'm also a clinical educator supervisor. So the way I bring it to my work is I work with clients, and I receive referrals from people from clinicians who say, "Hey, this person's having some um, religious preoccupations. Can you talk to them?" And so oftentimes what I'll do is I go in and I'll do an assessment with them. And the assessment is a fairly in-depth assessment, and it can take half an hour to an hour, or sometimes it might take 2 sessions. And what I'm trying to do is to understand the sort of origin of their spiritual experiences.
Mm.
Sometimes, and sometimes we come away and say, you know, these really seem like they're kind of based in a mental illness presentation. You know, we just strongly encourage you to adhere to your, you know, the treatment that's being recommended to you by the team. Um, and sometimes we will say, hey, you know, it looks like you've had one or two transcendent experiences, but they've gotten mixed up with some religious delusions along the way. And it might be helpful if we try to sort of separate those for you. And then we'll do a little bit of psychoeducation about what is a transcendent experience versus what is a mental illness. And then depending on the wellness of the person, they can either engage in the um, you know, sort of holding on to the mental illness experience, or actively working to let go of it. So it's about kind of teaching the client to say that A, B, and C are mental illnesses. Like, we don't have any doubt
Wow.
about these being mental illnesses. D and E feel like they could be positive influences in your life. And it might be worth trying to sort of explore some of those experiences. Now, sometimes we have some really good success, but depending on the, you know, the nature of a person's illness over a period of time, like some people have very fixed delusions, and it might not be possible to help them to sort of extricate those experiences from their delusions. And unfortunately, you know, you can only plant a seed sometimes, and it's really up to the client to decide whether they want to do anything with it. But other times we've had really positive experiences with clients. So, you know, one fellow I worked with was a fellow who had a bipolar illness, and uh, he had what I would describe as a textbook transcendent experience when he was 23. Now he was in his 60s at the time that I met him, and when I met him, he was very sort of poorly groomed. He was underweight. He spoke very rapidly. It was often very difficult to understand him. You know, kind of classic mania sort of presentation, and that sort of thing. And over the course of a couple of sessions, he revealed to me that he had this experience when he was 23. And this experience um, always made him want to be a better person. Now,
Wow.
unfortunately, his bipolar illness was also developing around the same time. So you have these transcendent experiences, and you have these bipolar illnesses, which often kind of coincide together. So for some people, there might be a bit of a chicken and the egg argument. Um, so what we did, though, is we unpacked his transcendent experience, and this transcendent experience was very profound. It lasted less than a minute, but it gave him this profound sense of peace. And he said, like, he felt like he was given truth. Um, However, in his mania, which kind of occurred afterwards, and I should say, in this presentation of truth, he said that that made him want to be a better person and to make the world a better place. So it's always, transcendent experiences are almost always about trying to make the world better, or make ourselves better, improve our own condition. And so this person, he said, you know, in like 20 odd, in 30 years of therapy, nobody had ever unpacked that situation with him.
Wow.
He said that he had talked to several therapists and had psychiatrists, and they just sort of put that in the bucket of mental illness rather than trying to unpack what that experience was about. Now, the thing is, what makes that transcendent experience interesting is that it didn't repeat. Like in 37 years of mental illness, or however long it was, he never had another experience like that. Although he'd had dozens, if not hundreds, of manic kind of experiences followed by deep depressions. And so this we did a lot of psychoeducation with him. We said, so this is clearly mental illness. When you're sort of ramped up and you can't stop yourself and your thoughts are starting to go really quickly, those are clearly mental illnesses, and you should seek intervention at those times. But if you have this wonderful feeling inside that is giving you wonderful insight into who you are, and it's very short-lived, then that can be a transcendent experience. And the important thing is we really need to discern transcendent experiences. We shouldn't. Part of the problem is people don't feel like they can talk about these experiences. So we need to find ways to encourage people to talk about these experiences and then to debrief with somebody. Say, what the heck was that about? I had this wonderful feeling. I felt like I was experiencing what felt like truth to me at that moment. Now, how do I use this? How do I dig deeper into this experience without triggering or activating the mental illness?
It's so interesting because I'm wondering, like I said earlier, how many people have had these experiences that have just been brushed aside and are lucky enough to encounter somebody like you who's like, no, let's investigate this a little further. Is it possible to have a transcendental experience within a manic episode?
Yeah, I think it is. It just it makes it so there's always wisdom that we need to seek, right? So there could be wisdom coming to us through mental illness. You know,
Ooh,
our, our
interesting.
our brain is a very complex thing. I mean, if we look at many of the wonderful artists throughout history, they had wonderful insights that came to them through mental illness experiences. The problem is that sometimes people become fixated and then they get stuck on a particular idea and they begin to sort of perseverate and ruminate on that idea. And then it becomes very, very difficult. So, one of the things that we've discovered is that, with all mental illnesses, early intervention is really, really important. The sooner, the better that we can get to people is better. By the time some people are older, and a delusion becomes kind of fixed, becomes very difficult to get people out. And I have to say that I have not had any experience, any success working with people when they have a delusional belief that has become fixed. But you can have, an interesting theological conversation with people.
Yeah, because I'm wondering what happens then if somebody is having an experience that they would describe as spiritual or connected to God that they think is part of their higher purpose and is feeling to them like a good thing. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And then you're looking at it and maybe assessing that I don't think that is transcendental and it could be problematic. How do you navigate this conversation where somebody's feeling like this is their purpose in life or it's part of their divine right, and you have to sort of unravel that and classify it in a different category?
Yeah, again, it's there's a therapeutic word for when you have to kind of repeat the message. We call it fogging. It's just like sometimes you just have to repeat the message and hope that the client eventually hears it. And again, sometimes when a delusion is so fixed, it's, you know, the client's defense mechanisms are so strong at that point that it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to break through some of those delusional beliefs. And we just have to kind of let it go. And like, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, I have to practice detachment and recognize that that's part of that person's journey. And yeah, I've done what I can, and I have to let go and move on to the next person.
It's an interesting too. I mean, if you're a person who does believe in a higher power and we're all sort of connected, then the conversation about mental illness is interesting. And you know, if everything has a purpose, what is the purpose for these people's journeys? I want to know what your colleagues feel about your work. Like, are we moving in a direction where the spiritual conversation or transcendental work that you're doing with your clients is becoming more accepted and maybe sought after, or do you still feel like it's at the peripheral?
It definitely feels like it's growing. You know, when I started, you know, it really depends on where people receive their training. So like right now, the last time I checked was a few years ago, so it might have changed. But the last time I checked, the only medical school that included spiritual assessments as part of their training for physicians was University of British Columbia. I don't know if other schools have embraced spiritual assessment as part of their training. But what I have discovered is that younger doctors are more open to having some of these discussions.
Mm.
You know, up until like 1990 was a turning point. There would be psychiatrists who would tell their clients not to go to church or not to
Ugh.
go to temple because it would interfere with their mental illness. And then at the same time, you had psychiatrists who came from a religious background who would be saying, you must go to church, you have to go to church. And neither of those are good ideas. We have to always follow what the client, what might be beneficial or helpful for the client. Um, so what I've seen is that psychiatrists who come out after 1990, the American Psychiatric Association issued a kind of cease and desist order and said that a person's religious beliefs were not relevant to a person's treatment unless it could be demonstrated that it was specifically harmful. And we should not be recommending that they do or do not attend a religious institution. And so people who have been trained after 1990 seem to be much more open-minded to spiritual care. Plus, we're getting lots of physicians who come from other places in the world where spirituality is much more ingrained in society. And so I find that those physicians are much more open-minded. So like right now we're working with, on a research project with couple of physicians from Israel, from I can't remember the Middle Eastern country, and from India, and other places, and we're looking at research into spirituality and how it affects people with addictions. Um,
Ooh,
yeah,
I love that. That's so cool.
yeah. So it's kind of interesting to look at that, but I do see some of my colleagues who are probably more Western North American based who are just like ain't having any part of that.
Yeah, and you know, it makes sense if people are going to schools in North America that aren't putting any emphasis on spirituality. It goes against everything you've spent your life training for to have somebody come in and be like, well, what about a spiritual solution? And I can understand their point of view, but like I said, once you have an experience, it becomes really hard to argue that it's not beneficial. And I'm curious now. So it sounds like if somebody is having a specific episode that is intertwined with religion or God or anything in that under that umbrella, then they bring you in to sort of help them. But what if somebody is just a regular person who is experiencing some mental health issues, would you ever introduce the idea of spirituality or transcendental experiences to somebody who has mental health issues as a way to help them move in a more healthy, stable direction, even if it's not on their radar?
Not usually. Like using a client-centered approach, we have to be very careful that we're not kind of falling into the category of proselytizing. So we really have to take our lead from the client themselves. So I just had a situation the other day where a client is very ill, and the father has asked us to go in and pray for them. And we've had to say, well, if the client wishes us to pray, we'll be happy to pray for them. But if the client doesn't want us to pray, we're not going to pray for them. That would not be ethical in our view. We have to take our lead from the client and from the client's belief system, not our belief system. And so, like, our training as spiritual care providers is very clear about bracketing our beliefs from the client's beliefs, which is very different from, say, clergy. Clergy often come in with their school or their tradition on their back or on their shoulders, and they bring it with them, and they use it as part of their intervention. We, on the other hand, are trained to not do that.
Yeah.
We're very sort of clear about the fact that we have to work with what the client is presenting. And now I might occasionally suggest, I might ask, as part of my assessment, I will ask, do you have a faith tradition that you belong to or have participated in? Have you had any interesting spiritual experiences in your life? And, if the answer is no, then I'm just going to leave that. I might suggest some mindfulness breathing if they're having some anxiety disorder kind of issues, and then we'll try to unpack that. But again, the goal for me isn't to try and get somebody to cultivate a transcendent experience.
That makes sense. I think obviously you need to have strict parameters that you work within when we're dealing with people who are prone to delusions, and introducing the idea of God could obviously go in a problematic direction. Have you ever seen a serious mental health crisis open the door for a spiritual experience that was really dark, really, really bad for the person who's experiencing it, and then something happens in that darkness where a crack opens, and then they're like, oh my God, something happened, and that sort of takes them in a new trajectory in terms of their health and stability?
Yeah, there's I don't know if you've heard of something called post-traumatic growth. It's what happens is some people have let's say, a car accident or something like that, and it causes them to experience post-traumatic stress disorder, and part of that might include an addiction or a depression or something like that. So it can be very common for people to be in a very dark place and then have a kind of awakening experience where they look back on that post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, addiction, whatever, as something that led to their growth. So there's a lot of research right now in this area of post-traumatic growth, which is very interesting. And there's a lot of spiritual experiences that people are talking about. We should also say that everybody's transcendent experience isn't the same. So a lot of people experience peace and joy and love, but some people experience darkness and fear. Which is why a colleague of mine says, the reason that in the Bible, angels always appear and then say, "Be not afraid," is because they're showing up with like fiery swords in the middle of the desert, and And of course, that's going to be frightening. Be not
Yeah.
afraid.
That's so funny.
I'm afraid.
Oh,
So,
terrifying.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've talked to some people who've had very frightening transcendent experiences, which reaffirmed their faith. So, like, if you have like this, I was talking to this fellow once who said that, he just in his regular kind of prayer life, he was praying and he got told to go and tell this couple that they needed to seek counseling. And it was a couple in his church. And he said he didn't actually know this couple. He thought that they were a good couple, a good, healthy couple, and that sort of thing. And the funny thing is, they were just on the cusp of getting a divorce. And
Oh my
the
God.
fact that he had said to them, "Listen, I was saying this prayer, and I had this very terrifying feeling, like somebody spoke to me and told me that you needed to go get counseling." And so I'm just telling you what I experienced. And they went and got counseling, and they saved their marriage, which is very interesting. So for this person, the transcendent experience wasn't helpful. This person does not want this experience to reoccur. Most people with transcendent experiences, because they're pleasurable and joyful, they want them to reoccur. But this person was like, no, had enough of that. Seen it. I believe it. I don't need any further proof or evidence. so, um, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think that's a great point. And it's also reminding me of people who do plant medicine. They'll go and do ayahuasca because they want to open the door of the divine and have these messages, and it ends up being terrifying for them because not it's such the angels in the Bible. Oh my God, what a great reference. Like how terrifying that would be for somebody to be going about their life and then seeing this type of in like something you can't really describe happen. And it happens with plant medicine when people are trying to make this spiritual awakening happening. Do you have any opinions about things like plant medicine and
Yeah, I'm very interested in that, especially ayahuasca. I'm very skeptical about the kind of like weekend retreat where somebody goes down to South America and has this kind of experience. Like what I've read is like the indigenous people, they have a long, long discernment process that occurs before and after the taking of plant medicine. And we're so arrogant in our Western culture that we think, oh, well, I'll just go down for a weekend and take some ayahuasca, have a interesting, funky trip, and then come back. Like the research that's being done in Germany and other places in Los Angeles is people who are taking LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and ayahuasca and peyote. They do this under very controlled situations. Like they have what's called trip sitters. So you have somebody actually staying with you during the trip because it can be extremely frightening for people. And then there's like a debriefing period that happens afterwards. I haven't personally done this, but I also know, like, for example, our own Indigenous people in Canada who use sacred medicines for to connect with the divine in various ways. It's done under controlled circumstances. It's not a party drug, and it should, I think, never be used as a party drug. This isn't. This is meant to be for your own experience, for understanding yourself, but again, under controlled experience. We in the West, we want everything yesterday. So we don't want to take the time to go through a kind of mental and emotional preparation period before we do this, have somebody that we can debrief with after, and then go through a period of further debriefing. We just want to go down for like, oh, I've got vacation time next month. So, oh, I saw this thing. I'm going to go and do this trip and see what it's like.
I think because there's an idea of awakening being like a switch. Like you can go for the weekend, take this medicine, and then come back awakened and connected. And it's the commercialization of spirituality where these ideas of instant manifestation and being connected all the time and always being a high vibe, it is problematic because it gives this false sense that being a spiritual person means that you're happy all the time or that you're constantly
Right.
you're making lots of money, you have the perfect partner, you have the best job. But all of those things are so far from what I have experienced when you meditate and you have that inner peace and clarity. The last thing on your mind is anything outside of whatever is happening internally. And so this is also something that's come up a lot in my conversations, is just the modern idea of spirituality that seems to be so tied in with concepts like manifesting and these weekend retreats. And it's a watered down version of these really ancient practices of these plant medicines that I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. Can they be presented in a weekend format? Lots of people think so. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm just skeptical of the weekend. I mean, I've had my spiritual awakening when I was 28, and I'm 54 now, and I feel like I'm still learning. And in some ways, I feel like I'm still right at the beginning of my journey. In other ways, I feel like I've learned so much and gained so many insights. Um, it's all very fascinating to me. I work in a multi-faith environment, so I love talking to people from different traditions about their experience. So talking to, Jewish people about Kabbalah or any of the mystical traditions in Islam, Sufism, and those sorts of things are fascinating. But to your point, I was listening to John Cougar um, talk about him and his wife went to this sort of it was a what do you call it, a revival, that's it, the word. They went to like this revival tent thing, and they got themselves baptized, and they said like for half an hour we were like ecstatic, and then we weren't, and then we went home. But that's a kind of sort of capitalistic way of looking at these experiences, is like, oh, I went and purchased this thing, I had a cool experience, and then I went home, but there's no like further discernment about, what was that experience like, and what does that mean for you in your life, and how do you want to use that experience to help other people or help yourself.
Yeah, integration. What do those experiences mean if you leave them at the tent?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I think like the largest problem with a lot of these experiences, because they're so universal, is that we tend to put them into clubs. Like, oh well, I had this experience in my club, and so my club is the better club. So whether you come from like a Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, our brains tend to only associate those experiences with the particular club that we were participating in. And so we tend to think, oh, well, these experiences only happen with this particular club. So this club is the better club, and I should, to stay with this club.
Yeah, it's yeah, I think this what I've learned in my own spiritual journey is that it's a very wide bucket, and there's lots of room for interpretation, which is why I love having these types of conversations, because you if a person experiences something, they experience something, and if it helps them and it gives them the sense of oneness with the world, I think that's a positive thing. It sounds like you have a personal spiritual life outside of your work. Is that true?
Yeah, yeah. I find that if I don't practice my spirituality, I'm susceptible to periods of depression and suicidal ideation. And I haven't, knock on wood, I haven't drank in 24 years, but
Good for you.
those
Congratulations. Wow.
those temptations do come back. And so I find that if I'm not participating in my spiritual life, uh, uh, that I'm susceptible to those. So that's one of my medicines. I particularly use Reiki and personal prayer as a way of being connected to the divine, and just discerning my own path and trying to find ways that I can be as good a person as I can. I also have ADHD, and one of the things that I've been trying to focus on is increasing my ability to focus my attention on one thing at a time. So I've been trying to increase my ability to read for longer periods of time without being distracted. And in the last couple of years, I've started to really have some success in that. So I don't know if my ADHD is just starting to remit with age, or I'm just having some more success because I'm mentally focusing on trying to expand my attention ability.
Since you are a spiritual person in your personal life, it's something that's important to you and it is your profession. Do you ever feel frustrated or too constrained in the work that you do? And do you wish there was more room for you to intervene with people or maybe show up not unannounced, that's not the right way, but it was a more accessible form of treatment for people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do, you know, I love working at CAMH. CAMH is a wonderful place, but every hospital has policies and regulations, and so I would love to do more kinds of spiritual treatments with people, but we require that there be sort of like an insurance thing in place, and that there be informed consent, and which obviously all of those things are important. It's just that with, like, for example, with Reiki, I would love to be able to do Reiki with some people, but to be able to get insurance to do Reiki would be a little bit difficult, you know.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I can imagine.
yeah, how do I explain that to the insurance broker? Well, I'm sending energy to a person. What are the possible ramifications of it? Well, we don't think there's any negative side effects to this. How do you know there's no negative? So it goes all back to, like, evidence-based interventions, and what kind of research has there been on things like prayer and Reiki and things like that. There's very little that could be considered what we would call evidence-based. Although there's a lot of really fascinating research that's going on about, people doing psychic interventions and things like that, but it's not really at the point of where we could say, oh, this is actually happening. We can go from
Wow.
A to B, but we can't go from A to D yet.
I need to look up the psychic interventions. I haven't heard that. That's right up my alley. I
Yeah.
love that.
But I think that even, like, we should have like a good scientist put on our scientist hat and look at these things with appropriate skepticism. Like, let's keep an open mind. Just because we might have a kind of predilection towards uh, the spiritual, let's ask and see if there are other things that might be happening that might also explain these things. So we have to keep a good objective perspective.
Yeah. It's like UFOs. Yes, they're unidentified flying objects. That doesn't mean they're aliens, you
Right,
know?
right. Yes,
Yeah.
there could be other explanations. Yeah,
Um,
correlation is not causation.
there you go. So just to wrap things up, if somebody's listening to this, and maybe they're something's happening in their life that's making them question their own mental health, and the conversation about spirituality is filling them with a sense of hope, and maybe they're unsure about what is going on with them internally, but they are hearing you and us talk, or maybe they read a book and they want to explore a spiritual solution before anything else, or with other treatment. Do you have any advice for people who are just at the early stages and curious about spirituality and mental health?
Yeah, I definitely encourage people to explore their spirituality, and especially if you are having a mental illness experience and you think that maybe you've had a transcendent or spiritual experience alongside or even within the mental health experience, it's really important that you find a therapist who would be open to having those discussions. And I can leave my contact details for you later, so if people want to reach out to me, they can do that. Uh, um, but try to find people who would be open to having those conversations. And I think that there are more and more therapists and psychiatrists who are open, but don't discount the possibility that you might also be having a mental illness. And it's okay to have a mental illness. There's no shame in having a mental illness. And embrace that part of yourself, because sometimes mental illnesses give us great insights into ourselves and the world, and give us a bit ways to see the world that other people can't really see. So the other thing is discernment. Always try to talk about your experience with other people, and try not to, I know it's tempting, try not to leap to conclusions. One of the things that happens a lot is if you have, say, bipolar illness and you've had this experience, you might suddenly start to think that you're special. And so what happens is some people start to think, oh, I'm chosen to be a prophet, or I'm chosen to be this or that. And what I would say is that these experiences are very common. The research that I've seen is as many as 30% of the population has these experiences. So that doesn't mean that you're a prophet. It doesn't mean that you're special. It means that you're having a special experience that you need to try and find a way to understand. But really caution you from going off and suddenly thinking that you've been imbued with special abilities or special powers. That doesn't mean that. It just means that you've been given an interesting insight, and how are you going to use that insight at this moment? And it doesn't mean that you can afford to ignore the mental illness. And it doesn't mean that the transcendent experience is going to take away the mental illness.
That's great. That's so great. And I do think it's beneficial to include your contact info for anybody who wants to reach out and is maybe looking for guidance. So I'll be sure to include that. This was such a great conversation, Shawn. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I find your work fascinating. I had no idea that you could get a master's in this type of work. So I'm gonna go look into that immediately. And I look forward to seeing, following your career and seeing what happens, because I think what you do is very beneficial for people. And I can tell that you're passionate, and we need more of this in our lives. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been my privilege, Peter. I appreciate it very much. Thanks for the invitation.